Good evening, everyone. On behalf of ASANA Voices, we would like to sincerely thank our audience and panelists for their time today. 2020 has without a doubt been a challenging year from many standpoints. I really hope that you're all safe and well. I wanted to take some time to introduce the ASANA Voices team who will be moderating today's panel. My name is Yash Bajaj and I use he, him pronouns. I am from Metro Detroit and I am our Chief of Public Policy. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of ASANA Voices, from Los Angeles, our audience and panelists for their time today. Neeta Bhojwani from Los Angeles is our Chief Operating Officer. Neeraj Maheshwari, also from Metro Detroit, is our Chief of Programming. And last but not least, Prince Bhojwani from Los Angeles is our Chief Executive Officer.
Thanks, Yash, for kicking this off. Again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening to unpack this really critical issue. We know we can't do this in one evening, but we're glad that you took some time to get this conversation started. What I want to do before we go ahead and dive deeper into this program is actually talk a little bit about how ASANA Voices got started, what we aim to do with this organization, and a little bit more about what to expect tonight. After George Floyd's brutal murder, the four of us realized that the South Asian community and existing organizations were quite simply not leveraging their platform to facilitate these discussions. So we took it upon ourselves to just, form that organization and build that for all of us. ASANA Voices, the Alliance of South Asians in North America, is a platform to educate and engage in dialogue that addresses economic, social, and political issues. The goal is to eventually become the infrastructure for economic, political, and social change for South Asians in North America. Furthermore, we want you to know that we are absolutely committed to making this community, this organization, this movement for all of you. On that note, I'm super excited to announce that between our panelists, the moderators, and the audience, we're representing 2 North American countries and at least 4 different South Asian countries. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Neeta so she can talk a little bit more about her 4 brilliant panelists.
Hi, everyone. I'm Neeta, and I'm really excited to introduce our 4 amazing panelists, each with diverse backgrounds and areas of expertise. First, we have Dr. Amer F. Amer is an organizational strategist who helps institutions and leaders address diversity, equity, and intercultural development. Throughout his career, Amer has worked with large organizations, higher education institutions, nonprofits, schools, and community groups to create an understanding and change among key stakeholders. Second, we have Devika Daga. Devika is a political technologist on the Montana Democratic Coordinated Campaign and a Technologist Fellow at the National Security Institute. Her interest in this field began in 2008, where she was an intern and field organizer on the Obama campaign. It was there she learned how technology could be a force multiplier for development and advocacy work. Next, we have Sheela Lal. Sheela began working in local government, starting with the 2008 Missouri congressional race, which evolved into the Missouri State House and state government transparency work. Later, she worked in government transparency and communications for 3 legislative cycles and volunteered on 5 local 2016 electoral campaigns. Currently, Sheela organizes with the Rising Voices of American Families and is a founding organizer for Dearborn for Black Lives. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Anoli Patel. Anoli began her career in law, but later transitioned to education and has been fighting for social justice after learning about the inequities that some communities face. Anoli joined the education movement in LA, where her dreams of opening an elementary school had started. She believes that students are the products of their expectations and not their environment, and envisions an inquiry-based program with a social justice charge where students can become empowered leaders, finding their voices to create the necessary change. I'm going to pass it over to Neeraj, who will be talking about the House rules before diving into questions.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Neeraj Maheshwari. Thank you for sharing your evening with us tonight and for being here. Before we begin our questions for the panelists, let's all just take a few moments to outline what this call is and is not intended to accomplish. So this call is not meant to tell you that your thoughts and actions are right or wrong. We're not here to compete with one another in the sense of who is more culturally competent than the other. We should be clear, though, that there's nothing political in people stating that their lives should matter and that they deserve to live in a world without prejudice, discrimination, and violence. By politicizing human rights issues, we offer an excuse to dissociate ourselves from conversation and action. This call is intended to facilitate honest dialogue and introspection. No matter how well versed you are about the topics we will discuss today, we encourage you to approach today's webinar with an open mind and a willingness to hear perspectives that may challenge your own. We hope that after the next 60 minutes or so, you'll walk away from today's town hall with a heightened sense of urgency in acknowledging and addressing anti-Blackness and racism within the South Asian community. To make today as interactive and constructive as possible, we do encourage everyone at home watching to post your questions to the YouTube chat throughout our call, and we'll do our best during the last 30 minutes or so of today's program to address those questions. And finally, there's a link to a document with key terms that are defined in the YouTube description for your reference. So without further ado, let's begin our questions, and we will start with Anoli. So Anoli, our first question for you, as a founding principal who helped shape the worldviews of young minds, how early in life do you feel children can learn and demonstrate racism?
Thank you, Neeraj, for the question. I think before even thinking about children demonstrating learning about racism, we first have to be conscious of how our minds are shaped in general. And once we do that, we realize it's everywhere and in everyone. Children are constantly experiencing day-to-day life, hearing languages from family members, friends, educators, strangers even. And what all of those have in common is typically that the child is around adults who should expand on what the child is hearing and seeing, especially when the child has questions. They can support the child in reflecting on what they're experiencing as well. And what getting to the second part of the question is when they're alone. And so what adults need to be more cautious about is when children, what they're seeing when they're alone, typically on media, TV, movies, social media. And so according to our definition of racism, the child first must understand the idea of power and how to use power to discriminate. So a very short story, when I was about 8 years old, my neighbor, who's a 4-year-old girl who is white, told me, "I don't play with brown people." Her statement, along with the implications of that, is very much open to interpretation if she was being prejudiced, racist, oppressive, or unjust. But as a 4-year-old, in a 4-year-old mind, does she know what she was saying? That's the first question that we need to ask. What did her statement mean to her? What was her objective? Where did she get that thought of? Why is skin color something that is in her mind? And so as a founding principle, in shaping those views, those conversations and reflection are key to really having the child understand how power is played into discrimination and how we can actually first be united.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
So I'm going to take the next question. Devika, this one's for you. As a public interest technologist, how do you think that data can be used to guide institutions to not only uncover racial injustice, but help guide them to reduce instances of racial injustice?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess before diving into that, I do just want to say that though I am working for a campaign, all my views are my own. And yeah, so my background, the work on a campaign is in tech. And I think something I've learned recently is that data, right, is not strictly objective. And so while, right, we can be well-intentioned in using data to help uncover injustice, I think it's really important to understand that data is an output, and most likely, or almost definitely, human decisions were made to inform the inputs. If you take the internet, for example, there is nothing objective about how Google presents its search results. There is a very dominant male and Western-centric point of view that gets encoded into the organization of information. And right, this is not because those engineers are explicitly racist. It's just, maybe lack of knowledge about the social consequences of their work. So I think with this in mind, I think instead of just looking at data, my approach and what I would encourage institutions or really anyone that's looking at data to make decisions is to rather think about things from first principles and interrogate the data pipeline. So what does that mean? That means asking questions like, where did this data come from? What was the initial problem statement? Why did we use these keywords and these metrics? Who decided that, right? Who was at that table? And what preferences are encoded and compounded in this data set? I think only when we start thinking more holistically about data, not taking it for granted, will we really start to kind of make real strides into kind of reducing, as you said, the instances of racial injustice in any form of data-driven sort of organization.
Thank you, Devika. That's a really interesting point that I haven't thought about. My next question is actually for Sheela. So within the South Asian community, we've often heard that all lives matter, not just Black lives. And given the impact that Ferguson had on your consciousness and action, how do you explain the differences between the two statements? And then how can we effectively engage non-Black minority groups in this cause?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I just want to level set with the audience. I've been in some form or another trying to find the best path for me in political engagement since I was about 14 years old. So when I talk about these things, it's not because I'm an innate expert. It's not because like I was born this way. It has legitimately been a lifelong process in unlearning what has been taught and also finding ways that my strengths play to creating a more just world. So I actually learned about Michael Brown Jr.'s murder when I was traveling through Southeast Asia. And as somebody who's from Missouri, I felt like really, really unnerved by what was happening, but also a little bit of like distance, like emotional distance from what was happening because I was so far away. And so obviously I couldn't tangibly do anything except keep up with the news and try to process it all. I came back and worked in the Missouri legislature starting that next year. And so I started to get a really strong understanding of how policymakers who are usually not paid attention to because they're at the state level and they're not like the sexy federal level work, I got to see how they took out their anger on a really important conversation of Black lives mattering. And that form of oppression has really, like understanding how oppression can be dealt by a policy really expanded my mind and thinking about what are the quote unquote unintended consequences of laws. And if you move even further back, like from any angle asking, why aren't Black folks able to do the same thing as white people, as South Asian Americans, as Latinx, as like whomever, you're really getting to the same answer, that their lives in America have always been seen as lesser than by those with power. And if we don't recognize how we as South Asian Americans continue the legacy of violence, it's really disingenuous to claim that anyone is equal and that all lives matter.
Thank you so much for that. That was extremely insightful. Amer, my next question is for you. How can we engage the often unstated implications of colonialism that have been internalized in our community to confront bias in the forms of anti-Blackness and Islamophobia?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hidden trauma and stories in South Asian communities that we oftentimes don't talk about. As an Indian Muslim and a person coming from an Indian Muslim family, it's very, what I've noted is the ways in which we don't talk about colonialism, in particular the partition and the traumas that exist in a lot of our families and the stories that don't get told. And all of that related to the broader colonial experience in terms of how we've internalized color and the very, I think, explicit ways in which we talk about color and beauty and so forth and where that comes from. And so there's that element. Then there's an immigrant experience coming to the United States. And I know for myself growing up in the Midwest, it was a very clear dynamic, white or Black. And we weren't very clearly articulated into how we fit into this whole situation. But I think for a lot of immigrant parents, they looked at the situation and looked at it. It's very evident that they came here for economic opportunity, and they came here for what they see white people having. And it's not subtle what the circumstances of Black people are relative to that. And I don't want to be in that category, right? So then it's this process of positioning in relationship to whiteness, right? And then there's the messaging we receive, right? The colonized mind, the colorist mentality, and we're here to get what, I mean, whether it's explicitly stated or not, we're here to get what these white folks have. So what's going on with these Black folks, that's not our issue. I will say though, another aspect of being South Asian Muslim, and I would say particularly Indian Muslim, is that it's a different experience in relationship to African-American, in particular African-American Muslims. And that creates a dynamic and a connection and a whole other set of challenges as well that doesn't exist with other South Asians. And I think it's important to name that as well.
Thank you for that.
I want to actually expand just to clarify what I mean by that. In my community in Ohio, there was a mosque for Desis and there was a mosque for African Americans. That's not unusual, right? And so, and yeah, we did some iftar dinners during Ramadan. We did some clothing drives for the poor once or twice a year, but generally we were segregated. And our mosques are in different parts of town and so forth and so on. And so there's this interesting dynamic amongst South Asian Muslims in which we have this connection to African-American Muslims through religion, but then we also have these broader social dynamics playing out that are kind of reflective of the broader US kind of racial dynamic and class dynamics as well.
That's really interesting to think about. You know, sharing a common faith, you would think you have so much in common off the bat, but unfortunately, ethnicities and the color of our skin can still segregate us. Thank you for sharing.
I'm sorry, one last thing, I apologize. There's also the class dynamic amongst South Asians, right? Which South Asians are more likely to be positioned more similarly to Black people in terms of class and poor Black folks. So you see Bengali communities in Hamtramck and Detroit area and so forth, positioned very differently than well-off professional class South Asians living in suburban, predominantly white suburban areas.
So our next question will be back to Anoli. Anoli, you were sharing a story about growing up as a child, even at the age of 4. Little girls and little boys might say things like, I don't play with brown people. So thinking on that point, as a leader of an institution that plays such an important role in the development of a child's life, how do you start to unpack those issues with your colleagues or even the child population who may or may not hold the same beliefs as you do?
This is like such a great question because this is the first step. So the first step is to understand and unpack how we view ourselves, what creates our own identity. Through that awareness and of one's own identity, having dialogue and understanding others' identities and the intersectionality that plays, we can first better acknowledge and ground the differences among all of us. So once we understand our own identity, the impact of it on ourselves and how we view the world, our actions, our thoughts, our own mindsets, and the impact of that in our own circle, outside a little bit of our circle, in our society, and then the world at large, then and only then we can start unpacking the issues. So at Stella Elementary, what we do is we engage in professional and personal development sessions around diversity, equity, inclusion, because my teachers, my staff, we have to know what we think about ourselves, because our words, the language we use, the curriculum we even implement, they must be culturally conscious, so that then we teach our students in that way. And so something that we're very proud about is our restorative practice lens. And so what that does is it focuses on individual and community relationships through conversations, through reflection, and throughout those conversations and sessions, we can start to introspect, oh, why did I do that? Oh, why do I think this? Oh, they think that, but they came from the same community I did. How come they think something different? As opposed to just doing the things the way we always used to. As opposed to doing that, if we first can start understanding the why behind all of that, and first ourselves, because really we're just bigger kids. That's really what we are. And so once we understand that, then we can start helping a child understand and unpack oh, why don't you want to play with that person? It's okay right now that you don't, but let's first just talk about why you don't want to and what that person might feel. If they feel this, how can and how do we want to make them feel in our community, in our own little school? Then we can really start having that conversation. But again, that first big step is to understand it in yourself, and then again, having the impact of your own identity at the forefront.
Mhm.
I absolutely love that, Anoli. I think I know the four co-founders, we always talk about approaching these issues by introspecting first. Don't pose anything as an us versus they. Ask yourself first, why is it that I'm approaching this issue or this problem or whatever a certain way? And it's so awesome to see that someone that engages with so many stakeholders, such as yourself, approaches it in a similar way. My next question is actually back to Devika. So can you provide a few examples of consumer technologies that acquire biases that perpetuate anti-Blackness within our own community? And then, if such examples exist, how can we be mindful of you when you're using these tools? Because we've just grown so used to having these with us at all times.
Yeah, so I'm going to reframe the question a bit, because I think the problem is about more than acquiring biases or biased AI algorithms or something like that. And sort of to echo what Sheela was saying before, right? Like a lot of these things that I've learned about tech and race, right, have been through deliberate unlearning. I worked at Google for 7 years, worked in AI, and quit because of a lot of the things that I saw and felt were highly unethical. And one of the people I've learned a lot from, she's a sociologist named Ruha Benjamin. One of her core messages is that racism is inextricably tied with the capitalistic need for efficiency, profit, and social control. No matter what industry you're talking about, but specifically in tech. And furthermore, one of the greatest innovations of capitalism is disguising racism. And what does that mean? Well, we no longer have slavery, but we should ask ourselves, are we really free if you graduate college with massive debt? If you can't vote because you were formerly incarcerated? If you're stuck with a dead-end job that you hate just for health insurance? If you have to go to work with a fever because you don't have sick leave? So these are all burdens and debts that disproportionately fall on Black and Brown people due to the cyclical nature of poverty and disenfranchisement. So back to your question, I don't think you can talk about anti-Blackness and racism without also talking about the system of oppression, which is modern capitalism. And in the tech industry, right, due to virtually zero regulation, right, it's laden with oppressors and abusers of power. Like I can think of many examples, say Uber and Lyft, right? People of color make up a disproportionate number of full-time drivers, and the company denies them basic benefits. My view is that their biggest innovation is labor exploitation. You can think about Amazon through Ring or facial recognition. They profit off of systems of oppression by selling surveillance technology that then we've seen, right, supercharges police abuse. And I think probably the biggest, right, I don't even know how you would kind of compare these abuses, but is Facebook, right, who is deliberately profiting off of hate speech. So these are, right, I think this is now sort of mainstream, right? This is not kind of sort of niche topics that just progressives talk about. I think there is deliberate kind of mindfulness about this. But I think as technologists, what you can do more, I think, is to empower yourself with knowledge, right? Read Ruha's book. She's written several. And I think know that you're participating in the system. I think small things like tipping your drivers and your shoppers, right? They don't get healthcare benefits, and Obamacare is really expensive. Don't buy an Amazon Ring. And I would say if you can't boycott Facebook, then turn off these targeted ads, right? These are all kind of carrots, and we don't have to be complacent bystanders, right, in this system. So.
I mean, thank you so much for bringing up those points. I think that's definitely an aspect that needs to get talked about more. So I appreciate you calling out specific examples and even calling back your time in tech. So going back to Sheela, we generally see an uptick in awareness right after stories and tragedies are heavily publicized, but unfortunately that dies down, slowing all momentum built towards changes at that institutional level. What do you think happens to this global movement fighting for racial justice, and how can we keep that flame going?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Amer for his really accurate description and dissection of a lot of the seemingly benign problems in our communities. Honestly, made me feel less alone in my own analysis. So that's also a nice byproduct of these town halls, where we actually get to see that there's other people who think like us who may not be in the same region, and people power is real. So to answer that question, I actually think it's a pretty, like at a high level, a very simple answer. So Black Lives Matter started in 2014, post Ferguson, and they've been working for 6 years to understand the systems, like from a policy perspective, that are actively killing them, and then changing those policies. And right now it happens to be that moment where they're able to get enough non-Black support to push those policies through. And so in terms of like global movement, fighting for racial justice, like all of our consciousness is being awakened in different ways. And once it's awake, you can't turn it back off. And so while we might not be like out in the streets 3 months from now, people are still going to be fighting in their city halls, in their state legislatures. They're going to be figuring out ways like Devika to work on campaigns or to do tech policy work. People are going to find their lanes and continue to move forward and find the best tools that keep it sustainable. I'm not particularly worried about, I'd say 50% of people who are showing the Black squares on Instagram, I'm not worried about 50% of them continuing this movement. And then I can share some resources that I've actually developed for my own networks on how to figure out how to get involved locally, and like just a basic framework to start thinking about local engagement as direct action as opposed to, oh, that's something that retired people do. And then I've also created a 70-slide government accountability deck. It's just a basic 101, and it's for Missouri specifically. So if there's any Missouri listeners, you don't have to do any work. But if you're not from the state, you can use it as a way to practice understanding government at any level, whether it's at the state or local level where you live. And I'll share those with the ASANA team.
Sheela, thank you so much for that. Your work sounds incredible, and I'm really excited to be able to share these resources with our viewership, and even just look at it ourselves. You talking about people power, it exactly was what I was thinking when I'm listening to you guys. These are issues that I've thought about a lot, but just even being able to listen in with you four has been extremely insightful, and I feel myself growing. So thank you. Amer, I'm going to take it back to you now. Diversity, equity, and inclusion continues to be an area of emphasis in higher education and in some workplaces. So how do you create environments in which students or other parties feel comfortable sharing their experiences, regardless of the belief system they may hold close to their identity? And I think this is a particularly relevant question because of what we're trying to accomplish here, So any insights you have?
Yeah, well, I think that, there's a business case and then there's a moral case. Right. And sometimes we are so our zeal for the moral case for racial justice and equity and social justice more broadly sometimes doesn't always recognize that that's not necessarily always the best intervention in how you create change. We happen to be in the social moment where there's a broader set of people that are more open to an invitation around racial justice and social justice. But generally, in organizational environments, the business case has to be made because people need to be able to understand what difference does it make for my job, for what I'm doing here. Why do I need to care about these things? And before we talked, I talked to you about the importance of cultivating skills and behaviors and systematizing that in an organization as opposed to trying to legislate attitudes and beliefs, because you get a lot more resistance right? Because when people are told what to believe, they push back, right? So instead, for me to be able to understand that I can't control whether someone's homophobic at home or racist at home, right? But what we can do in our organizational environment is set an environment in which we have expectations that everybody is working on a certain set of skills. And here's why, right? The business case for this is the difference that it makes in our ability to execute what we do, right? All these different perspectives and ideas make us stronger and better and create more creative and innovative. But it really comes down to how do we harness the diversity in the organization. So, because a lot of times, so just think about the PR snafus that happen in organizations, like a commercial that many people viewed to be racist or something like that, or the Gucci turtleneck or the turban, the Gucci turban, or with the white person wearing it. And a lot of times our question is, who was in the room? Like, did they have diversity in the room? Here, the more important question is do you have a culture in which the people in the room of those various diverse backgrounds, if they have voice to be able to articulate that there's a concern that you might not be considering this perspective, and will something different be done because of that? That's how you create a learning organization, an adaptive organization that actually harnesses these perspectives, right? And so when you see those incidences of an organization, a PR incident, right, it usually exposes something in their culture in which they're not truly valuing the experiences and perspectives of the people that are in the organization that could otherwise have prevented the whole thing from happening in the first place.
I think that's a really important point, Amer. You talked about not just having the presence of cultural diversity, but making sure that those individuals and groups have a voice at the table as well. So thank you for sharing that. And I do believe we'll have time for another round of questions for our panelists. So let's jump back to Anoli. As an educator, Anoli, the execution of your ideas require multiple parties, including relevant community organizations. So how have you leveraged those different partnerships to create a foundation that helps combat racial injustice?
This is a great question because, I mean, school is one of the biggest institutions that needs to rely on the community and who makes up the community, especially with the charter network that we work in. And so first, before we go out into the community, we need to look inward as an educational institution so that we are serving the community with what the needs are. And so a little bit of context, Bright Star Schools is the charter network that I'm a part of. We are created of 9 schools, 3 elementary, 3 middle, and 3 high schools that serve all throughout Los Angeles, 1 cluster in the Valley, 1 in Koreatown, and then 1 in West Adams. And so what our vision and our overall mission is to create holistic learners. And so with that, part of what we do is we partner with an after-school program that partners with all of our schools to provide extensions of the Stella Elementary learning that include character education and, more importantly, exposure to sports, to arts and crafts, hobbies, different things that our children are interested in. And so with that, our students participate in basketball tournaments. They learn how to cook. They learn how to build things together. And so that's one of the ways that our after-school program connects with our school, especially serving the needs of our younger students. But more importantly, I think thinking outside of West Adams, we even think of our curriculum as its own community. And so teaching tolerance is something that we use for our social studies curriculum. And in that, there's various activities and lessons around diversity, equity, and justice. And so with that, we again need to be conscious and look inward and say, okay, what are we teaching our students to celebrate? Are we celebrating traditional holidays that are rooted in racism, like Thanksgiving and July 4th, Columbus Day? Or are we teaching freedom, unity, celebrating the cultures we have? My background is Indian, Gujarati, and this past March, I led a Holi event, our traditional festival of colors, and all of our students were excited. Some of our staff members came, and we got to celebrate spring and a holiday that they might not have been exposed to if I didn't bring that into our school, right? Ruler is our social emotional approach to learning, and that's rooted from Yale's Emotional Intelligence Center. And so with that, it teaches how to understand your emotions. With that, you lead to understanding your feelings, understanding your behavior, understanding the consequences of behavior. So back to my earlier responses, before even thinking about, combating racial injustice, we have to create a strong foundation in our children. And we also partner with the IIRP, which is our restorative practices community, which again, teach us how to be in a community, how to value us as individuals, what we're feeling, what we're thinking. Let's dive into reflection before we make decisions. I engage my staff in decision making with that in mind. What do I need to do to serve my stakeholders, right? And so similarly to what Amer and Sheela were saying, it's really kind of thinking about unlearning and then learning a strong foundation for what we need to move forward, especially when thinking about the our elementary community.
Mm-hmm. It actually got me thinking, Anoli, is that, I went through elementary to high school and college out here in LA. And, part of your elementary school experience out here is that you do, or I think most schools end up visiting one of the big Catholic missions out here. And to be honest, it took me, I think I was a fourth grader, and it took me years after the fact to understand, oh, wow, this is actually what went into building these missions. Mm-hmm. And so that plays right into, what a lot of you've said in terms of unlearning what you might have learned. And it's not that we learned it with, intention to almost erase that thing, but it's just, we've learned in a certain way where it's almost difficult to think outside of that. Yeah. Before I, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, and I think back to my own elementary experience, and with that, as a fourth grader, I was questioning that. I was like, wait, but who built these? Who was here when these were built? And the teacher was like, oh, is this lovely way of these missions being created? I was like, but wait, there were slaves back then. And then there were people who they came and they took over the land. And I was trying to really understand it. But my teacher, my fourth grade teacher, shut that down. And then going to eighth grade, we went to DC to, part of the eighth grade trip. And somebody who played Abraham Lincoln was giving us a speech and all of that. And I asked him, I said, wait, didn't Abraham Lincoln also own slaves? Because part of the history was the way of the land. That's what it was. And I was shut down again. No, I fought for slaves and I did this. I was like, no, I understand that, but the society was in this way. And so part of that, again, looking inward, is really understanding what we're teaching and what truths are being taught in what way. Just because it's a really hard concept to understand and there might have been a lot of hardship and power and injustices, you can always scaffold it down to teach the child in whatever age they are. But I think, again, the most important part is teaching it in that way and not covering it with something with flowers because we want to make it sound pretty. But it's so anyway, I just had to throw that in because I completely remember the same thing. And it's I don't want to shut any of our kids down, especially if they're thinking in that way.
Absolutely. And so actually, before I get into my next question, this is just a general thing. We are noticing that there are questions and thoughts and experiences flowing in through the YouTube chat. So keep on doing that. Four of us are just monitoring and we have that queue built up and we're going to address all of those momentarily. Anoli, that was wonderful. The reason I actually brought that up is not too far from where a few of us live. There's a statue that's been there for such a long time that's just been removed. And that got me thinking about, those experiences that we just mentioned. Devika, on to you. So I know, a lot of my questions was about tech. I was super excited to pick your brain there. I do want to learn more about, what you've seen on the campaign, various campaign work, but really for South Asians, I want to bridge that gap. So my question to you is, how can South Asians continue to support racial justice outside of voting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I view voting, voting is good, but voting is oftentimes the end outcome of a very lengthy process, right? It's democracy is sometimes not unlike sales, right? Where it's a lot about conversions and getting people to convert to kind of your point of view. And so voting is kind of the last stage of conversion, but it's really about everything that has happened before that in all those interactions. And so I think about, racial justice and it's really about, it's hard for me to say, right, what your role should be. I think everyone has a different role, right? And that speaks to your kind of, where you're coming from, your sort of, what you're bringing to the table. If you're someone like me who is definitely more of kind of an activist type, that may look very different than someone whose role may be to listen, right? So I think everyone has a different role. I will say one thing, the campaigns I've worked on, before this, I worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and a lot of what I've learned about, supporting this work has to do with this concept that I think could help this conversation is about being a radical revolutionary. And I bring this up because I think that, when you hear this word, you kind of think about, being an activist and going to protests and really at its core, being a radical revolutionary is actually just about affecting change in your everyday space and place. Whether that's at home, with your friends, at school, or at work. That is what kind of the people-powered movements are about. It's about people in their communities having those hard conversations with the people around them. And part of that, right, is being a radical revolutionary is taking risks. That means standing in the gap for someone else, whether that's physically or proverbially, right, in the classroom or in the boardroom or in the office. Not looking the other way when someone makes a crude joke. So, in many ways speaking up. And the other thing, I noticed a comment about, bridging the generational divide and how to talk to other people. I think the biggest thing I've learned about this topic in kind of the South Asian community is that to be a radical revolutionary and to be in this movement, you have to be willing to take on not just your adversaries, but also your allies. Right. So you may be comfortable writing a comment on your Trump supporter Facebook friends post, but what about having an honest and open conversation with your racist aunt and uncle and cousin? Right. These are all kind of ways that we can all be agents of change within our own community. And there's tactics for that. Right. And that's kind of a whole other thing. But, in the campaign world, we call this relational organizing. It's about harnessing your personal relationships to affect community change. And I think that's what I would love to see more of is people stepping up and having more hard conversations within their communities, whatever and wherever that may be.
I mean, that's a great point. I'm so glad that you brought up the term radical revolutionary. It goes really similar to what I was going to ask Sheela. And it's that in the South Asian community, you might see that it's really easy to stay quiet about issues that may not directly affect us. So how can we stop shying away from these conversations, particularly about racial tensions? And how can we start these conversations even just at home?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody who's watching this happens to know me personally, you know that I've never been shy about chatting about these issues. And I think that's because at its core, I was raised in a house where I was encouraged to not shut up. And I think that when we look, at least when I look at other brown women, I see this very gendered conditioning of being quiet, staying quiet, and just kind of doing what you're told. And that plays into this larger conversation that we have to have around not just like how do we like empower women within the household and like think about gender norms, but also why are we bringing over like very imperialist ideas of gender or of like place and space and how we present ourselves. And so when I was thinking about this question, I was actually thinking about what is our end goal when it comes to speaking up. And it's, in my opinion, wanting to feel so innately disgusted with like racism and microaggressions or any show of oppression that we speak up immediately, we don't question it. We're just like, oh, gross, like why would, no, like bro, sit down. Like that's what I think we all want to get to. And so the barriers that I see along with like the gendered social conditioning and like the fear of like challenging the status quo, which is across the community regardless of gender, it's also this very deep fear of messing up. Like we have been positioned as the model minority for so long that God forbid we fail. And God forbid that we also don't have like our Black brothers and sisters back if we also haven't been unlearning as we go. So there's a lot of factors that play into this, but at its core, I think that we all deserve to have better anti-imperialist education and reframing along with anti-racist education and reframing because they're one and the same.
Thank you so much for that, Sheela. I think thinking about, how we can start these conversations at home and among ourselves, it kind of leads me to my next question for Amer. We were talking a little bit before about your diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you do. And so, starting these conversations at home is definitely important and a key piece, but there may be members of our audience who may want to lead, the charges of starting diversity, inclusion, equity type programs or just starting the conversation more informally in their own organizations. And so given your background and experience with these topics, what are some key points that you think they should walk away with to ensure that they're creating spaces for diversity and self-expression wherever they go?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of organizations, there's employee resource groups, and I think that's important. And I want to connect this to some of the other things that we talked about earlier, because what's racing in my mind right now is how difficult it is for so many South Asians to bring political and voice into the public sphere because the messaging, from a lot of us coming from immigrant families, the messaging being, don't talk about controversial things, stay quiet, and just be happy that they let us in their country, and so forth. And then, of course, many of us don't agree with that. We were born here. We feel like we're American. But at the same time, there is this there is this sense, this dynamic of what happens when I don't do exactly what my parents and my community told me to do, right? And now I'm a bad person, right? Because it's not just that you're disobedient, X, Y, and Z. And so we have to name all the layers in which we have to overcome to be able to do these things, right? And it requires an incredible sense of resilience and self-confidence, because you're going to catch heat from your family and your community for doing so, for many of us. And then the other element is a lack of historical context, right? So folks come over here, they're looking at the situation through a capitalist lens, in terms of what they came here for, the economic opportunity, and they don't understand what's historically occurred in this country, right? And therefore they can't teach us that. So we have to take it upon ourselves. So I was a Black Studies major for my bachelor and my master's degree, along with cultural anthropology, which again blew people's minds, of course, from my community. And my parents would not tell people from our community that I studied Black Studies. They wouldn't do it. They would say cultural anthropology, even though it was like, what is the scope of anthropology? Like, they're like, what is that? But so like that was enough. But the thing is that if you don't have the historical context, you can't understand why certain things are happening in this country the way that they are. And then therefore you can't even understand your own circumstances. And so then when something like 9/11 happens and all of a sudden the visceral hate is pointed towards us, for me as a person who was studying Black Studies before that, I wasn't surprised. But so many Desi people were surprised that all of a sudden it was like the ire was turned towards us. And it was like, wait a minute, we thought that these white people liked us, right? No, have you looked at the history of this country? So we have to do that in order to, and we have to bring that consciousness forward into organizations, into different settings, and into to our politics. And the ultimate example is in New York City, in which you had a coalition between Muslim and Sikhs and other South Asians who were subject to the surveillance that was going on in New York City of mostly Muslims throughout the Northeast Seaboard, and those that were being impacted by stop and frisk. And they built a coalition, and they were able to come together and dismantle both of those policies as they built solidarity around those things. But that all starts from a level of consciousness. We step into the spaces that we go to so that we can create those opportunities for solidarity.
Thank you for sharing that, Amer. We will try to address some of the questions folks have been asking at home. And so one of them has been touched on by a couple of our panelists. Devika, you brought up the idea of being a radical revolutionary. And Sheela, your thoughts on imperialistic attitudes and how they affect our beliefs and our perspective. So this question comes from Mega, and she asks, as a South Asian teenager, I've often heard older individuals in our community perpetuating racist stereotypes. How can I respectfully address this and convince them to think differently? And we'll just keep this open for all the panelists. Any of you can feel free to address that question.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, something that, I've been sort of playing around the idea of is this idea of calling in versus calling out. So I think there's a lot of call out culture, right? Which is essentially, publicly shaming people. And I've found that, right, no one wants to be made to feel stupid. And I think what we've probably, all found is that if you are talking about someone older, right, that for many reasons, there's a lack of awareness. And so, right, we should assume maybe that they are operating in good faith. And maybe these things are just biases. And so I think thinking about how you can call people in, right, as opposed to calling people out. And so that means, right, whether if that's in a public setting where this comment was made, right, maybe pull that person aside and explain to them how it made you feel, right? I found that anchoring on a feeling as opposed to an abstract concept is one way to kind of make this not a right or wrong thing. This made me feel this way. Sharing stories, for example, I think these are all tools of engagement that bring it back to you, right? You are the kind of common denominator in this sort of equation, right? Not this kind of abstract concept of Blackness. So I would, again, encourage you to bring that person in and explain to them how it made you feel, how their comment made you feel, and maybe explain your relationship to Blackness, whatever that may be, as a way of kind of, right, anchoring this around you and your relationship, because ultimately, right, that person may not know any Black people, and it's up to you to kind of solve for that.
I just want to follow up on just another tactic, because Devika really hit it on the nail on the head with that. I found that also while you're learning yourself, having and sharing those conversations with your parental units or family figures helps create a dialogue and show like, hey, I'm learning, like, I just want to share this with you, especially as a teenager. It will feel overwhelming to kind of speak truth to power. And I totally get it. I think that by bringing in people, like Devika said, into the learning process, and then as Devika also mentioned, like relational organizing, asking or like kind of creating the expectation that if we're all learning, we should all be having these conversations in other social settings. So like a quick story, my parents, they started to understand more about like Missouri politics because I was working in it. And my mom, like my parents for the longest time were like, I don't know what you do. And then she came to a fundraiser and saw that a lot of my work ended up being in working with elected officials, candidates, and like developing a sense of like expertise in that space or respect in that space. And she was like, oh, we can do this. And in the past 3 years, every time I'm home and there's like a family function or like a gathering, I know my mom is going to call somebody out, like guaranteed. And it's not because I asked her to, it's because she's also done her own unlearning and relearning. And it's just like really exhausted by people not doing it too. So there's ways to leverage your family friends to make a positive difference, even if it seems small.
Does anybody else want to chime in, or we can move on to the next audience question? All right. I have a question from Anna that says, I find myself constantly arguing with many of my friends that all lives matter. And I know we touched on this a little bit before, but she says that all lives matter misses the point. Hoping the panel will elaborate on this a little more. So if any of you have any thoughts, please feel free.
Sheela, I feel like you should take this on.
Yeah, I was actually hoping Amer would also talk about it with his years of experience kind of mitigating this. So I think like just asking like why they feel the need to say it, like just asking why and like kind of getting to the root of it. And I don't know how old you are, the question asker, but there's something really powerful in just being able to highlight like a story. So like for instance, I was listening to a podcast on like the development of dominoes, and I was sitting with it and thinking, could a Black man at the same time achieve the same results? And the answer was blatantly no. And there's all these different reasons. And by just like kind of comparing that, those lived realities, you start to highlight for somebody that the phrase Black Lives Matter isn't about eroding anybody else's value, but about bringing Black lives into the zeitgeist and like really getting people to care about systemic inequities.
And I absolutely, Sheila, I totally agree with you. And I think what we also, to the participant, you have to understand the culture of power determines what version of history is told, retold, right? And so that also, the culture of power determines the standard to what everything else is compared to, whether it's in favorable or unfavorable ways. And so with this, understanding the difference of all lives, Black lives, the culture of power has already created systems to keep themselves in power. And so before even diving into why, like what the difference of those two are, really diving into the history first to understand the present and why and how the history impacted the present events. And so we see it in a recent American history with once overt slavery was abolished, the government found different ways to keep themselves that dominant group, whether that meant through the justice system, criminalizing the Black community, disparities in sentencing and crimes. And that's why we see a disparity with Black people being murdered. I mean, putting it blatantly. And so really what the difference of that is, before even getting into that nitty gritty, really looking at American history will allow the conversation and those questions to start being asked and that reflection to be had. So that's what I would encourage you to do as well.
So I want to take this a little bit of a different direction, not about that phrase, but honestly, I don't think that we spend enough time really thinking about what whiteness is and how uniquely different it is from most other human kind of identity experiences on the planet. So I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but my entire life growing up, white people would say to me, I wish I had a culture like you. And, I think many of us have probably been to other countries. I've never been anywhere else on the planet in which people say that they didn't have a culture, except for here. And it's the result of a history of construction of whiteness and assimilation into capitalism that happened here in the United States. But the thing is that it's important, like for me, growing up in an environment that was overwhelmingly white and Black, and I wasn't, it was just like watching this dynamic. And there's an element, right, to which we cannot fully relate to this dynamic that's going on. We cannot fully relate to why certain attitudes amongst white people or exist, because it's seeped in a history and a generationally passed down dynamic, and our trajectory into that is that these people that have been inputted later and are positioning in relationship to it, but it doesn't mean we understand it, right? So if a Desi person is saying all lives matter, I truly do not believe that person understands the implications. I mean, I know a white person doesn't understand the implications when they say that, but there are many white people that say that intentionally because they want it to be articulated that way to push back. But I think a lot of Desi people have not really reflected on how we're positioned in this in-between, unarticulated kind of dynamic in between whiteness and blackness.
And I just want to add on to that, and this idea of whiteness and other, because I think it's important to also understand the kind of the aspect of coalition building, right? Because I think South Asians, at least in my experience, tend to coalesce around each other, right? And I think the only way you can fight white supremacy, right, is through coalitions, right? And that coalition is actually bigger when you think about each group of non-white people together than as each one apart. And so when you think about Black people or Asian people or Latino people or South Asian people, right, the sum of those parts are so much greater than white people. And so I think the more, right, we can think of, it's not just all, it's our, Black Lives Matter, but the reason you should care about that is because we are part of this larger coalition of minorities in America. And because of that, right, we have a responsibility to fight, first to build power, but also to fight white supremacy together as one group. And that's, again, what kind of this idea of, of not thinking of ourselves as an other, right? We are, of course, different ethnicities, but we are inherently all not white. And there is something in that inextricable that links us together. And I think we need to start kind of, I hate using the word leaning in, but like, just kind of, leaning into that more.
Devika, thank you for that. And I just want to say one more thing about this around the elements of what we sometimes don't understand about whiteness, the ways in which sometimes white people are using us to justify to themselves that they are not racist. That by befriending us, and we feel good about it, right? But by befriending us, they can oftentimes use relationships with us in order to prove to themselves that I'm not racist. So therefore, my attitudes about Black people are justified and okay, because I'm friends with Amer, right? So how can I be racist? And so again, we have to have a deep unpacking of what it means to be us in the midst of all of this, so that we can do exactly what Devika is saying.
So since our discussion has been talking about whiteness, our desire to have proximity to whiteness, and unpacking what that means growing up, one question is coming from Neeraj at home, and he asks, what can South Asians born and raised in America do about colorist attitudes held by the Indian population, or any South Asian population? For example, that fair skin is supposedly more preferable to a darker skin tone.
I think, so unfortunately I couldn't share my PowerPoint, but I did have like a theory of change for South Asians, and it's super basic. It's three things. Like, South Asians across the board, South Asian Americans specifically, need to talk about caste. Talk about it, talk about it, talk about it. Talk about how it infiltrates even small things in your behavior, how it excludes people from temples, how it makes people feel really uncomfortable and other than. Talk about how it presents in labor, whether gendered or structural, how it presents in color and value within colorism. The second thing is to break down our internalized divide and conquer mentality when it comes to other South Asians. So like if you happen to speak Kannada, you hang out, your family hangs out with other Kannada speakers. If you're Bangladeshi and you're from Sylhet, you hang out with other Sylhetese people. If you're Pakistani and you're Punjabi, you hang out with other Punjabi Pakistanis. But we need to actively break that down and develop relationships with people our age and then intergenerationally who reflect that diversity within our own society and sit with the tension that is inherent in a subcontinent that has had culture forever and had conflict forever. And then the third thing, and it seems pretty niche, but I think it's super important, is South Asian Americans, whether born and or raised here, have a very, I think, kind of toxic attitude towards new immigrants and don't actively try to be friends or get to know folks from what we would see as our country of origin. And by omitting that part of our like cultural understanding, we stay in a stereotypical idea of South Asia, whether it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives. And we need to we do ourselves a massive disservice by not understanding what contemporary culture and history and sociology look like. And the colorism is literally just a byproduct of not having solidarity. If we are able to like come home and be like with our friends who are darker and then get our parents like will love our friends. And if they get mad at them, if they say stuff about colors, we can be like, you like my whoever like stand in Raj, like Raj is dark skinned. Do you not think he's valuable? Like there's a really strong value to having a diverse friend group, especially within the South Asian community.
And
Thank you for that, Sheela. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anoli.
No, just to quickly add that on that too. It seems very basic, but asking why, right? So a very quick story in college, you know, went to go get ice cream with a friend. She's Pakistani, she's more fair. We were trying to find a place to sit and I'm like, oh, let's sit here in, you know, in the sun. Like I'm cold, I want to like sit in the sun. And she's like, no, I don't want to get dark. And I'm like, what's wrong with being dark? And she's like, I don't know, I just don't want to get dark. And even that, she didn't know why she did not want to get dark, right? And so even unpacking that a little bit and asking why is it an insult? Why is that wrong? What's wrong with it, right? Even getting to those questions about yourself and again, unpacking it. I always have the teacher hat on, but unpacking why you think that about yourself, about others. And then again, that just always helps the conversation. So I just wanted to add that point. It might seem basic, but really, really unpacking and asking questions can lead to those broader conversations.
Thanks, Anoli. Does anybody else have any comments that they want to share for this question? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add, I mean, this is basically what Anoli said. I think something I've learned as a coping mechanism is, right, instead of saying what you mean, like frame what you want to say in the form of a question, right? It's so much more powerful and kind of puts the ball in that other person's court to then basically you're saying exactly what you mean to say, right? It's pretty direct why you're asking what you're saying, what you're asking, but it's so much more powerful when you use that kind of interrogative form of conversation to put it back on that other person. It's a really useful skill that I wish I learned a long time ago.
My favorite question is, can you help me understand what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's many.
Thank you, guys. Another question from home from Charlene. Hypothetical, you can pick a school for your kid that is either academically superior with strong grad outcomes but homogenous, or diverse but with below average outcomes. How should we think about this?
This is not a hypothetical. This is the reality of a hyper-segregated school district system and paying property tax, like allowing property taxes to be the way that we fund schools. My partner and I are looking at housing right now and recognizing that this is the quandary we sit in, and it's difficult. Do you have a child who doesn't understand class dynamics because you want them to get ahead? And I feel like my partner and I have slightly differing ideas on this, but I have a lot of discomfort with the concept of getting ahead at the expense of. But it's not hypothetical. It's a really horrific conundrum we've all put ourselves in.
I'm in the same situation. I live in a town with the highest concentration of Puerto Ricans in the country, and it's a working class community, and you know, we pay for Montessori to which is less diverse, and it really frustrates us because he gets articulated a certain way even in Montessori, which was a shock. Even at 2 years old, it was shocking. Like to me, like, wow, they're already starting this kind of deficit model, even though he's being exposed to 3 different languages in the home, but yet he's behind. And knowing that that wouldn't happen here in our town, but you know, we know the difference in the performance of the schools. It's a tough choice.
I'll chime in. I'll just speak from my experience. I went to private school for my education up to college, and that was the reason I decided to go to a public university. I think look, I'm not a parent. I don't know if I'll ever be a parent. I don't know if I want to be a parent. But I imagine if I was a parent and reflecting back on my private high school experience, which by the way has you know, an Instagram page as many suburban elite private schools do right now, called Black at NA, which is essentially a protest movement for all the institutionalized racism, you know, that is perpetuated at this elite institution for, you know, hundreds of years. So which is just to say, right, that what does academically superior even mean? And what is the experience that you want your kid to have? And what is your like philosophy of parenting, of life, of all of those things? I would not send my kid to the private school that I went to, categorically, right? I've written to them, I've told them that I think if you want to find one place that is a kind of dense form of white supremacy and elitism, no matter the grad outcomes, that would be a elite private school, without a doubt, right? There is no other place where you can experience tokenization, forget about racism, but where there is a administrative sort of impetus to hide and to mask and to control kind of any form of adversity, because right, it sort of looks poorly on them, and right, we're talking about capitalism, so their revenue and their kind of administration sort of admissions rate. So I think the world is changing, and I think experiences are going to be a lot more kind of let's say important than just your grades, right? Like I didn't do that well I did okay in school, but I would say I'm doing a lot better through kind of my public school education than my private school schooling, because you know, I think you need to understand what participating in these institutions could do for a child if it is, again, entrenched in sort of these ideals of elitism, also neoliberalism, but definitely white supremacy.
I should probably share the other side of the coin that I personally experienced. I went to public high school, a low income high school with a high dropout rate, with not much college going participation from the people who did graduate. There's no doubt that it was formative and that it shaped me. And there's no way I'd be doing what I'm doing today. And there's no way I would be doing it with credibility the way that I do it today without that. I wouldn't be married to an Afro-Latina spouse from Harlem. I wouldn't be, you know, none of those things would happen because I had these experiences at formative ages. But that was high school, which was different from, and that's the reason why my spouse, who comes from the Harlem River Projects, and myself make the decision with our child at this age, at a toddler age, that we're making now. And so these are tough choices. Then we also have two nieces that moved out of the Bronx on their side, and they came up here, and one went to Amherst High, which is considered a better, less diverse school, and the other one went to Holyoke High here in the town that I live in, which is mostly Puerto Rican, and they both had great experiences, and they both are doing well and getting into the colleges that they want.
So we will answer, or rather take, one final question from the audience. This comes from Neil, and he asks, it seems we are stereotyping white people just as white people might do to others. It is a dangerous slope that we must carefully tread. And so I guess his question might be, how do we avoid falling into that trap of kind of turning the tables on us and saying, how do we avoid stereotyping white people in the way that we feel they might do to others?
So I don't think this is nothing to do about white people, in my opinion. This is about building power, right? This is about building power to take back power, right? I don't think that we're saying that all, at least I'm not saying, and I don't think anyone else is saying that all white people are bad, but to not acknowledge that there are inherent privileges of being white in this country is, no matter if you're a good white person or a not good white person, right? It's just a fact that there is inherent power in your skin color. And so for me, this movement is about taking back and reclaiming power for ourselves and our community. And that means, and for Black people, right? And that means injecting ourselves into that movement first, so that we, right, as a coalition with all people of color, are perhaps on an equal playing field, right? Because right now we are not on an equal playing field. And that's the biggest problem, is that the premise of this country is false. It's just categorically false. And so I think the first step is just correcting the hypocrisy. And that requires it not viewing white people as a problem, but about, again, building power so that we stand a chance to operate on an equal playing field.
Okay, so I need to share again, once again, we have to learn the history of this country and the history of race, and understand that race is a social construct. It was created. It's not something that actually exists. What makes it real is the construct and the implications of that construct. Irish people were not considered white in this country. Jewish people were not considered white. Italian Americans were not considered white. It was a process of assimilation that over time, they became white, especially once they let the rest of us in after 1965. The line moved, okay? But what was the purpose of constructing race in the United States? First of all, it's first started around the process of transitioning from indentured servitude, in which you had Africans and Irish people, right? And the Irish people had the Catholic Church defending their rights, and over time, colony by colony, them moving to enslaving Africans instead of allowing indentures. That's the reason why you had free Black people, right? When they had to have their freedom papers to prove it. Okay, so if you understand that, you slowly over time, you start to understand the entire design of it is to pit poor white people against Black people. That's the entire purpose and design of the construction of race, because this country and all its laws were built for white male property owners. That's who had all the rights of voting and so forth. And to deepen your understanding of how compelling race became, right? And how not in the self-interest of poor white people in particular that it is hundreds of thousands of people fought and died in the Civil War to defend a system of slavery that they did not economically benefit from. Okay, that's the country that we live in, right? So it's not that it's not about bad or good. It is a system that is designed to strategically divide us in these kinds of ways. And there is a very real reality that if you're white, there's certain things you're just not going to experience as well. Both things are true.
And I just want to add one thing. I think you see this playing out in politics, and in the history of politics in the 60s and the 70s. This is the specific strategy of the Republican Party, right? It is to specifically organize poor white people. If you think about it from an economic point of view, poor white people and poor people in general are a larger coalition than just white people, right? Just purely mathematically. But the coalition that Republicans have built is one in which they have somehow built this American dream as a catalyst for poor white people to think that they stand a chance of becoming, right, the elitist establishment white people, when really they don't, right? There's not a chance, but there's this glimmer of hope set, and that's the kind of story of the Republican Party. And that's why you see, right, I think, again, the kind of the story and the rise of Trump is that this idea that you can kind of be you can live this American dream, right? You can be a business owner. You can't be this random guy who is quote unquote, just your average guy who's then going to become president. It's aspirational. It works. And for a white person, that story is a lot more compelling than the story of being pitted with the other poor people. And so the kind of strategy of the Republican Party is specifically that it's to pit poor white people against poor Black people. Whereas if you look at the strategy of, let's say, the progressive movement of Bernie Sanders in particular, it is specifically, right, to say we are a multiracial, multi-generational coalition, right? Those are like 3 or 4 very strong words to say, hey, we are the same. You have more in common and more to gain with us than you do with the Republicans. And I think dismantling that narrative it's really hard, but it is not a construct. It is something that we're living every day. And it's seeped in our politics.
So I'm going to push back just a little bit. I don't disagree completely with what you said, but I do think that right-left politics don't really capture the politics of white supremacy and racial justice and particularly liberation. And so left-right politics, so this is really reductive, but I view it as a debate primarily amongst white people about the enfranchisement of the rest of us. Primarily. I mean, I know that there's certain policy, but like just general, none of it is about dismantling white supremacy, right? And the last thing that this system of white supremacy has ever wanted is Black liberation and Black self-autonomy and self-determination, which is the reason why Black Wall Street got burned down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And so it's really important that we can hold that there's a certain value and importance to engaging politics in a particular kind of way right now, and that there's an element of limit to what this frame of politics have in relationship to how white supremacy functions as related to racial inequity in this country.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that movements are inherently outside of electoral politics, right? Like you need movements, you need people-powered movements to push, right, electoral politics further and further, in my opinion, left, right, in order to institutionalize the policies that we want to see, encoded in laws, right? But you need, right, that movement, that people-powered movement that is actually going to drive change. That itself has always lived outside of electoral politics, and it has to, right? Because it needs to be free of kind of the, I don't know, just the corruption, and ultimately it's people-powered, right? You don't want the kind of litmus for change is grassroots. And I think that's ultimately what drives people to our policymakers to make change at the policy level. And yeah, I mean, that's what a democracy is, right? We all need to engage and participate and push. I think that's what we've seen with this latest round of protests, right? People take to the streets and laws change. And that should be a wake-up call for everyone that that our voices matter. We need to ask for it, and not just ask, but we need to demand it.
I love that back and forth. I mean, just in that alone, I honestly wish we had like 3 or 4 more hours, because I wanted to chime in as well. Before we wrap up the night, I do want to thank the panel. You know, this was done all within the last 2 weeks, and you know, with everyone that we talked to, you four were so enthusiastic to help. You know, not only join this dialogue and lead it, but realize that the change really begins with introspection. That was something that we were really looking for. We're not looking for people who happen to think the same things that we do. In fact, you know, all of us on the team actually go out of their way to learn and sit down with people who they just might not agree with. And so thank you so much, you know, to the 4 of you for joining us for this. I also want to, you know, take some time to thank the audience. Again, you know, you joined us for our first virtual town hall. We're going to have plenty more. But again, you know, thanks for taking the time this evening to unpack with us 8 this really critical issue. You know, the 4 of us believe that lasting change begins with introspection, and introspection ultimately begins with asking ourselves these types of questions. And you know, it's not easy to do that. So you know, we hope that ASANA Voices is going to be one of your places to go to feel safe with your ideas, beliefs, and whatever. Looking forward, you know, we do have a lot of events and initiatives that we will be rolling out over the coming weeks. And the best way to find out and stay up to date with that would be by following us on Instagram at ASANA Voices. That's really it for tonight. Again, everyone, thanks for coming out here. Have a great night. Take care.